Well, thank you, Parami, for those kind words of introduction. I suppose I'd better begin by apologizing for bringing the rain. But I'm sure the farmers at least won't mind, and I'm sure we're all quite happy sitting here, dry and comfortable, and just listening to the sound of the rain on the roof, on the tent. People sometimes ask me what I've been doing, and nowadays that's not a very difficult question to answer, because there are certain things that I can no longer do. I can't any longer read, and I can't any longer write. And inasmuch as those two things did formerly occupy quite a large section of my time, it means that not being able to do those things, I have quite enough time, quite a lot of time in fact, for other quite different things. So I see people most days. I see order members, I see mitras, I see other friends, talk with them, explore the Dharma with them, and sometimes also study with them. I've also quite a lot of time for quiet reflection and contemplation and looking back over the happenings of the last so many years. I must also admit that I do listen also to listen to the wireless, to the radio sometimes, and especially to the news. And a few weeks ago I couldn't help noticing that there was quite a lot of news on the radio in connection with one particular subject, and that was the forthcoming Olympics in China. I'm not personally very interested in the Olympics. I've never been much of a sportsman, or as those of you who've read my memoirs will gather. But nonetheless, I couldn't help hearing these various news items about the forthcoming Olympics in China, in Beijing, but also I couldn't help hearing about the torch race that was going on. That is to say, there was something which I gathered was called the Olympic torch, and it was being passed from the hand of one band of people to another, from one country even to another, and ending up in China, and even, I believe, at one point, going up to the top of Mount Everest. So in this way, I did hear quite a bit about the Olympics, and quite a bit about that handing on of the torch from one group of people to another in so many countries over a certain period of time. So that put me in mind of something that I'd encountered in the Buddhist scriptures, and that is where the Buddha speaks of the light of the Dharma, the lamp of the Dharma, and speaks of handing it on to his disciples. I also remembered that in Chinese Buddhism there is a quite important text called the transmission of the lamp. The transmission of the lamp of the Dharma. That is to say, the history of the way in which the Dharma came to China, as it came to so many other countries in the East, being passed from master to disciple, and from that master to his disciple down through the ages. So we see that there's not just a transmission of an Olympic torch, but there's a transmission of the light of the Dharma from one generation to another. But at the same time, there's quite a difference. The Olympics and the sports connected with the Olympics quite clearly are in most cases competitive. People are not only doing their best, but trying in one way or another to outshine other competitors and to win that much coveted gold medal or silver medal or even a bronze medal. So sports do tend to be essentially competitive. But in the case of the transmission of the Dharma, in the case of the people, the followers of the Buddha, to whom the lamp of the Dharma is transmitted and who pass it on in their turn, it is not any question of competition. Rather, it is a question of cooperation. In fact, I would go even further than that. It's not just a question of cooperation, it's a question of collaboration, it's a question of what we call spiritual friendship. In the FWBO, as I think nearly everybody knows, we often speak of our whole movement, that is to say the WBO and the FWBO, as constituting a sort of network of spiritual friendships. A network which includes people from all sorts of backgrounds, all sorts of cultural backgrounds, racial backgrounds, class backgrounds, even former religious backgrounds, but all are part of this network of spiritual friendships. So this is one of the great characteristics, that I would say, of the FWBO and the WBO, in fact of the whole of our great spiritual movement, which started some 40 and 41 years ago. So we attach, as I'm sure most of you do know, a very great deal of importance to this aspect of the movement, that of spiritual friendship. And this reminds me again of certain other words that the Buddha addressed to his disciples at a time when it seemed he was concerned about the continuity, about the preservation of the spiritual movement which he had started after the gaining of enlightenment and his first teaching. And the particular passage which I'm thinking of is one where the Buddha addresses his disciples, in this case his monk disciples, after being questioned about what might seem to be almost a political matter. As some of you know, in the Buddha's day there were various kingdoms, various tribes, and some of those kingdoms were expanding, some of them were even quite aggressive, and they were in the process of swallowing up some of the small republican tribes. So it would seem that a representative of one of these tribes was concerned to ask the Buddha about the conditions under which his particular community, his particular republican tribe could survive, could not only survive but could prosper. So the Buddha gave some very good advice. I'm not going to repeat that advice now, because it was of a more or less ethical and political nature. But having given that advice, the Buddha proceeded to give as it were, a parallel advice to his followers. Those to whom he spoke were monks, but the principles to which the Buddha alluded were applicable not only to the monastic branch of his movement, but to all his followers. He was concerned that the movement that he had founded, after all, existed in the midst of the world. And it was a world which, even at that time, was not much more favourable to the continuity of a spiritual movement than the world is today. So I'm going to just run through some of the points that the Buddha made to his disciples of that day, points which, if they observed them, would contribute to the growth and prosperity of the spiritual movement, the Sangha, which he had founded. And the first thing that the Buddha said was that his disciples should meet regularly and in large numbers. So I'm very glad to see that on this occasion that advice, that admonition of the Buddha is being quite literally followed. We're not only here, well, one could even say that we're here repeatedly, because there have been other gatherings in the course of the year, gatherings of members of the order and members of the FWBO. But here we are on this occasion, the 41st anniversary of the founding of the FWBO, gathered together in large numbers. And I hope that this tradition will be maintained in the future as it has been maintained in the past. So this is the first thing that the Buddha mentioned, that if his spiritual movement were to survive, was to prosper, if the Sangha was to continue to grow, its existing members had to meet together repeatedly and in large numbers. Of course, I know that some people don't like large gatherings. Some people don't like crowds, as they say. But nonetheless, when we can gather together in this way, united by a common devotion to the Dharma, it's not the same thing as when you gather together for some more secular purpose, like maybe a football match or to watch a film. It's a very different thing. When we gather together in this sort of way, when we meditate together, when we do puja together, when we listen to talks about the Dharma together, a completely different atmosphere is generated. One might even say that a quite different level of consciousness even is sometimes reached. Well, I remember in this connection there was another incident in the Buddha's life when one of his disciples suggested to the king of the area that they should go and visit the Buddha at night. It was the night of the full moon. So the disciple conducted the king to where the Buddha was sitting with his disciples in the middle of the forest, in the moonlight. And the text tells us that they were all sitting there in perfect silence. And such was the atmosphere which was generated, such was the deep peace that the king felt just sitting there, or even just seeing the Buddha and his disciples all sitting there in silence, that he exclaimed, "I wish that my son could enjoy such peace as this." It is quite significant, I thought, that the king made that wish for his son. It seems that he himself had committed certain wicked actions and couldn't hope to experience much peace in this lifetime. But though he was a wicked man, he was very fond of his son. He wanted his son to have the best. He wanted his son to enjoy peace of mind. And he could think of no greater blessing for his son than the peace of mind that was being experienced by the disciples of the Buddha as they sat there in the moonlight on that night. So when we gather together, whether we sit in silence or whether we're communicating with one another, whether we're chanting, whether we're meditating, since we're all united in the Dharma, something, so to speak, collective is generated, even a different kind, a different level of consciousness, which many of you, I know, on certain occasions have actually enjoyed. So that was the first point that the Buddha made. And then he said, secondly, he wanted that his disciples, when they did gather together, they should gather together in harmony and disperse in harmony. And this word harmony is a wonderful word. We often use it in connection with music. We speak of certain instruments being in harmony, agreeing, blending, producing a beautiful and inspiring sound. So harmony among people, harmony within the Sangha is a very precious and a very valuable and a very beautiful thing. And sometimes I'm asked if I ever feel disappointed by anything. And I have to admit that there is one thing that does sometimes disappoint me or even pain me, and that is when I hear of disharmony within the Sangha. Disharmony, whether it's within the order or whether it's within a chapter or whether it's at a particular center or whether it's just within the Buddhist community generally. If I hear of disharmony, it disturbs and it disappoints me. So those of us who do in one way or another belong to the Sangha, whether as order members, as mitras or as friends, it's incumbent upon us to do everything that we can to promote harmony, not just the harmony of external agreement, but the harmony that comes when we have a deep feeling for one another, an appreciation of one another, and a realization that we are all treading the same spiritual path. Of course, this does not mean that we necessarily always agree, but it should be possible to maintain harmony even when there is disagreement about this or that particular issue. And this brings me to the question of tolerance. There's a lot of talk about tolerance these days, especially in interfaith circles. And I heard something of this kind of talk just the day before yesterday, when I was down in London at Lambeth Palace, attending a meeting of faith leaders, religious leaders, who were to meet with the Dalai Lama and have some discussion with him. So there was a lot of talk about love, there was a lot of talk about compassion, and a lot of talk about tolerance. But I have found over the years that tolerance, that the idea of tolerance is quite often quite misunderstood. To be tolerant does not necessarily mean that you have to agree with what others say. There are differences of opinion, differences of belief, which are inevitable. But the fact that one differs in belief differs in doctrine, differs in practice from someone, does not mean that one should have a negative attitude towards them. Does not mean that one should not regard them with what the Buddha called the eye of friendship. So, it's not that in order to be tolerant we have to accept that all teachings are the same, that there's no difference between them. That's a false conclusion. We have to recognize that there are very great and significant differences between the various religions of the world. I noticed that when the Dalai Lama did speak the day before yesterday, he made a clear distinction between theistic religions and non-theistic religions. And I was very glad to hear him making that distinction at a gathering where there were followers both of the theistic forms of religion and the non-theistic ones, like Buddhism. So that's a very important point, that to be tolerant does not necessarily mean that you have to believe that everyone basically believes the same thing or basically worships the same God and so on. No. There can be differences of opinion, at the same time there can be harmony. And that should certainly be the case within the Buddhist community, within the Sangha. We may have our little differences, practical and theoretical perhaps, differences of doctrine, differences of method, but that should not mar the overall harmony. There may be a little discordant note here and there, but sometimes even a discordant note can contribute, as in music, to the overall harmony. Now, the third point that the Buddha mentioned was also a very important one. And it was one also which might sound rather strange to modern ears. The Buddha said that within the Sangha there should be no change in any accepted practice or formulation. Everything should be kept unchanged. The laws, for instance, which govern the Sangha should be kept unchanged. Now, in modern times, people are very fond of changing things. People are crazy after something new. And the idea that you can't change anything will strike them rather strangely, and they may not like it at all. So we have to try to understand what the Buddha meant here. The Buddha certainly didn't mean that the bhikkhus, in this case, could not change anything at all. In fact, on a certain other occasion, he did say that they could abolish the minor rules if they thought fit. In fact, they thought fit after his death not to abolish them, but that was another point. I think the point that the Buddha was making, that there has to be continuity. There can be developments within Buddhism. There can be developments within the Sangha. And there can be developments within the FWBO. But they have to be in harmony with, in continuity with, whatever has gone before. And in a way, this gathering itself, this 1 week anniversary retreat, is an example of that. We're celebrating the founding of the FWBO. We're celebrating FWBO Day, except that this time it's a week-long celebration, not just one day. I can't remember just when we started celebrating FWBO Day. It was quite a long time ago, And for a while we celebrated it just over one day. Usually the day before we celebrated FWBO Day. But over the years things changed a bit. The nature of the celebration changed. And last year, as I remember, for some reason or other, no, so to speak, official celebration was organized at all. So I was not very happy personally about that, so I decided I'd give a talk on FWBO Day at the Birmingham Centre. I did, and we had a very, very good turnout. So we had a talk, I gave a talk, Dharmamati led a rather lengthy puja, and that was our FWBO Day celebration. Nobody organised it. It wasn't really announced much beforehand, but people came from, well, all quarters of the British Isles, it seems. Coaches were turning up outside, and the place, the Birmingham Buddhist Centre, was absolutely packed. So, but this year, well, a whole week-long celebration, so to speak, has been organised. And I'm very glad to see that so many people have gathered, and not only gathered, but gathered for a whole week of meditation and talks and puja, so that FWBO Day, or the anniversary of the founding of the FWBO, is being celebrated, but celebrated in a way that it hasn't been celebrated before. So there has been a change, but there has been continuity. On each of these occasions, on each of these years, we're doing the same thing. We're remembering, we're celebrating the original founding of the FWBO, but we're doing it in different ways, year by year, culminating in the way in which we're doing it on this occasion, this year of 2008. So this illustrates, I think, what the Buddha is getting at when he tells his disciples they should not change anything. He didn't mean that literally nothing at all should be changed. And of course, in the course of Buddhist history, a number of things have been changed, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. But the principle to be remembered is that the change should be in accordance with what has gone before. It should be the continuation of the tradition in another form, not something completely new, something foreign, which is merely added on to what we are already doing. So that's a very important point, and I'm glad to see that point exemplified in the way that, year by year, we are celebrating the anniversary of the FWBO itself. Then the Buddha made a fourth point, which is perhaps also, or not on the face of it, a very popular one nowadays. He said the elders must be respected. Here he was speaking, of course, of elders in the spiritual sense. Within the Buddhist community, within the Sangha, within the FWBO now, there are people who've been practicing the Dharma, practicing meditation, studying the Dharma for a very long time. Some of them for as many as 30 or even 40 years. So quite a lot of experience has been built up. And I think this has to be recognized, that there are some people with more experience, with a deeper experience, perhaps with a clearer vision of the Dharma than we have ourselves. And I have noticed that it's not necessarily those within the movement who are well known, who frequently appear in public, who necessarily are those with the deepest spiritual experience or the most consistent spiritual practice. I see in the course of a week, in the course of a month, quite a few people. I meet with order members, I meet with mitras, and I'm sometimes quite impressed by the level of maturity and the depth of experience of people who may not be well known within the movement as a whole. In some cases, of course, order members, in other cases, mitras. But people who've been practicing for a very long time. And it doesn't always show in any obvious way. But I think if one meets someone who has been practicing for a long time, I think one should take it for granted that they are, so to speak, an elder, and that respect is due to them. As I said, this is not very much in accordance with the modern outlook, but in the case of the Dharma, there are so many ways in which the Dharma is quite opposed to many aspects of modern thinking and modern belief. So respect for elders, respect for spiritual elders, this is one of the points made by the Buddha to his disciples. But then there's another point he made. He said that it was important, and I'm paraphrasing here, that there should be no backsliding. It's very easy to be carried away by one's first enthusiasm for the Dharma. Easy to be carried away by one's enthusiasm for meditation. And perhaps for a while, maybe for some years even, all goes well. But then somehow it may be that doubts creep in, or external influences play their part, or one takes on other responsibilities, and the Dharma and the practice of the Dharma is relegated more and more to the circumference of one's personal mandala. And one gradually sort of drifts away. Sometimes it happens with order members, sometimes it happens with mitras, sometimes it happens with friends. So the Buddha said this is something to be greatly guarded against, that falling away from one's original inspiration, one's original vision. If there is that sort of falling away on the part of too many people within the spiritual movement, within the Sangha, then the whole Sangha will decay and eventually perhaps disappear. So this is one of the most important points that the Buddha made, speaking to his early disciples. That you should safeguard your original inspiration, safeguard your original vision, keep up your contact with your spiritual friends. If you're an order member, keep up your membership of a chapter and make sure that you never fall away from the spiritual path. If a sufficient number of people, if a sufficient number of members of the Sangha do that, then the future prosperity of the Sangha, the future prosperity of the order of the FWBO is assured. But there were a few more points also which the Buddha made. One of the things he mentions is that within the spiritual community, within the Sangha, there should be a place for, so to speak, a minority of people who are devoted to a more intensive spiritual practice. We all know that there are levels of practice. Some people practice more intensively than others. But the Buddha was insistent that if the health of the whole community, the whole Sangha, is to be maintained, there must be at least some people within that community, within that Sangha, who are devoted wholeheartedly, with body, speech and mind, whether to the practice of meditation, or the study of the Dharma, or the practice of the Dharma in some other way. If there isn't that smaller body of more intensely committed people, then the health of the whole movement will suffer. So we really need to make a space, make opportunities for those who want to devote themselves maybe for long periods of solitary meditation, or long periods of Dharma study, or long periods of work for the Dharma in any other way. We do need that smaller core, so to speak, of people who do their best to live out the Dharma in every aspect of their lives in a very intense way. So this is another of the considerations that the Buddha urged upon his disciples. And the last one I want to mention is one that strikes a very positive note. The Buddha said that the members of his Sangha should welcome new members. Now, you might think that was a rather obvious sort of thing to say, that the existing members of the Sangha should welcome new members. But sometimes you find that groups, even spiritual groups, can tend to become a little almost exclusive, and not perhaps as welcoming to new people, new prospective members, as they possibly could be. So the Buddha emphasizes this point. When new people come along, whether to a center or on a retreat, make sure that you welcome them. Make sure that you make them feel that they are welcome, and do your best to make them feel happy and comfortable, at ease in what may be for them very new surroundings. I think we mustn't forget that if someone comes along for the first time to a public urban centre, or goes on retreat, and if they haven't had contact perhaps with Buddhists before, it's all very new, it's all very strange, and they may not feel quite at home or quite comfortable at first. So it's our responsibility to make them feel welcome, make them feel at home, and extend towards them genuine friendship, genuine fellowship. So this is the last point that the Buddha makes, that we should welcome those who come to join us, who want to join the Sangha, who want to join the FWBO, who want to join the order. We should welcome them, treat them as brothers and sisters, and make them as happy and comfortable as we possibly can. But the Buddha also added something, and he said at the same time, we should be mindful and we should direct metta towards the whole of the existing membership of the Sangha. So it's as though, in giving this advice to his followers, the last words almost that the Buddha speaks are metta and mindfulness. And as I suppose most of you know, that the metta bhavana and the mindfulness of breathing meditation practice are taught in all our public centres and very often on our retreats as well. So the Buddha's last words strike this double note, that we should extend our metta towards all our fellow members of the spiritual community, fellow members of the Sangha, and we should practice mindfulness. These are, one might say, the two great pillars of Buddhist life and Buddhist spiritual practice, mindfulness and metta. So I'm sure that in the course of the last week you've all had many opportunities of demonstrating metta towards other people who are here, and many opportunities for practicing mindfulness. I'm very glad that I could have this opportunity of coming here today, even though I did bring the rain, and the opportunity to speak to you and remind you of some of the things that the Buddha has said with regard to the welfare of the spiritual community which he founded. Words of advice which are as relevant to today as they were 2,500 years ago when the Buddha first uttered them.